Nobody, not even a conductor, would have the sheer ego to attempt a complete history of 20th century music. And indeed, this series has never aimed at being an objective or comprehensive view of it. It's been more like a selection of taster portions in some fabulous restaurant. We hope it'll whet your appetite for more. In this, the final programme of the series, we'll attempt to pull through some of the threads of our century-long journey. Stravinsky and Shostakovich, Schoenberg, Webern, Boulez, Stockhausen. These names all echo down the century, leaving a powerful legacy that has shaped and inspired so much recent music. Some composers have taken from them what they've needed to move forward, like Stravinsky did with Rimsky-Korsakov. Other composers have chosen to reaffirm the lasting power of tradition. In the happy absence of schools or dogmas, a myriad of different styles and colours have emerged, like a rainbow after a storm. Given the vast choice of new music available, I've decided to concentrate on 3 areas that are symbolic of these developments. Luciano Berio is one of the key figures of our time. He's a mass of contradictions built up of many different currents of thoughts. His artistic personality exists at that point where intellect crosses fantasy. This, coupled with his interest in montage, gives you the feeling that he likes playing games with his audience, forcing us to make connections between all kinds of disparate elements. It was hard to choose any one piece, but in Alighting on Labyrinthus 2, typically there isn't a Labyrinthus 1, we find ourselves immersed in the hallucinatory world that he's made his own. A collage of electronic music, theatre, jazz, serialism, and also the political idealism so characteristic of the 60s. It's a wild and wonderful mélange. He somehow managed to give a human face to the brave new world of Boulez and Stockhausen. Recently he wrote, "I was always sceptical of the idea that after the war we had to build something totally new out of the ruins. It was a very romantic notion. The idea of not getting your hands dirty with the past or with other dimensions of music may have been heroic, but in Italy we had a tradition, the operatic tradition, that was very difficult to escape from." There is in Berio's work an intense longing to make connections between the past and present. This seems to me one of the only unifying strands in the music being written right now. Dante's reflection on the meaning of music and the dreamlike fragments of 16th century madrigals, combined with quotations from James Joyce and Ezra Pound, float over distant echoes of some unnameable catastrophe. Fragments of a vision that tell us, like Beckett, that the moment you first perceive the world as a child and the moment you die is one and the same. In all our journeys, perhaps the only thing left is memory and listening.
La musica è tutta relativa, come si vede nelle parole armonizzate e nei canti. Tanto più dolce armonia risulta, quanto più la relazione è bella, perché massimamente in essa si intende. La musica trae a sé gli spiriti umani che quasi sono principalmente vapori del cuore, sì che quasi cessano da ogni operazione. Sì è l'anima intera quando lode, e la virtù di tutti quasi corre allo spirito sensibile che riceve lo suono. seguimi oramai. Che ci sta alle spalle?
E il sole.
E il sole in mezzo agli alberi.
E i bambini che dormono.
E il sole in mezzo agli alberi.
E i bambini che dormono.
E il sole in mezzo agli alberi. E il sole in mezzo agli alberi.
Classical form in music is like the architectural technique that built great cathedrals. It stays there, indifferent to history, wrote Berio. And as we approach the end of our century, much of it seems to be wanting to turn full circle towards warmth, romanticism, and yes, even sentiment. Hans Werner Henze, like Berio, is a man of many different aspects. His leaving home took many forms. As a communist and a homosexual, his exile to Italy from Germany in the 1950s was not merely a matter of preference. But maybe Italy was a conscious choice for him. At the very core of his being, he's emotional, a romantic, and he was never going to be at home in the aesthetic universe of a Boulez or a Stockhausen.
When I crossed the Alps in early 1953, in my car, which was loaded with a couple of suitcases, some music paper, and a few classical scores, I felt a bit like someone who had been rescued from a disaster. Schools came to present themselves and to impose themselves, and Darmstadt became the kind of annual fair, music fair, where composers could go and learn about the latest developments that had taken and were then sort of the order of the day, and everybody had to follow these new ideas and recommendations, forgetting completely that there is, for every composer, his own style, his own ways to go about music and think about music and make music available for his artistic needs. All that had been should now be forgotten. Everything will be different. The sun will transform everything. Crossing Tuscany, a broad and immense receptacle of grace and proportion, much silence, more forgetting, great expectations.
In going his own way, as he always does, he chose to spurn the rigorous home offered by many of his contemporaries, who then returned the compliment by ignoring his music, thinking it irrelevant at best, or even self-indulgent. But now his music seems more and more important, particularly in its direct appeal to the senses. He's found a way of continuing the aesthetic line which produced 19th century opera and symphonic music, whilst weaving new spells around it. Henze is essentially a storyteller, and much of his music has some kind of literary inspiration. His 8th symphony is based on A Midsummer Night's Dream, but as viewed through an essentially Italian sensibility. This is the Italy of the Decameron, of conviviality, and of warm, sultry nights. Shakespeare's magic wood has had a transfusion of warm Mediterranean air. Hans is a wonderful writer for the orchestra. When you hear the solo trombone farting, belching and lurching around, you can just imagine Bottom's attempt to be as graceful as Titania. At the same time, the passionate, elegant string and woodwind writing give you a picture of the Queen herself. And what I find endlessly touching is the way that the music can join together these two very unlikely partners. Just as the rise of communism cast its spell over the start of the century, so its collapse defines our own time. Literally leaving home was the only answer for some musicians like Stravinsky and Bartók. But for others, like Shostakovich, as we've seen, uneasy compromise was the only possible survival tactic. Until recently, much of what we knew about musicians in Eastern Europe seemed to indicate a terrifying conformity, the party line transmuted into sound, Without Shostakovich's ability to write in code, to produce two streams of thought, one acceptable, the other subversive, simultaneously, it seemed as if most of the music signified precisely nothing. Thank God this impression was just sheer Western ignorance, for the fall of communism revealed a whole generation of important composers who'd been almost silenced. In the best of them, an intense spirituality, perhaps born out of their difficulties, is central. Faith, stubborn, obstinate faith, must have been what kept these people going. It's hardly surprising that their music shines with an entirely non-Western kind of intensity. My first impression on meeting Sofia Gubaidulina was rather disconcerting. She seemed to have the face of a fierce Russian icon, but with the young Judy Garland's hairstyle. However, I soon found out that the icon was the real truth. She described very clearly to me how the ugliness of the surroundings that she grew up in forced her to look up into the sky for her inspiration. Her wish to explore all the advanced Western techniques of music that were banned in Russia, and to express the even more banned religious beliefs at the center of her heart, marked her out for struggle. When Shostakovich met her, he saw this immediately, and he said to her, "Don't be afraid of being yourself. My wish for you is that you should continue on your own incorrect way." She's regarded this comment as her watchword ever since. While surviving by writing film music, she cut her own experimental path in improvising and working with unusual folk instruments from her own region, like the bayan, a Russian relative of our own accordion. Typically, when she uses the bayan, it sounds nothing like an accordion. She uses it to make otherworldly sounds, and sometimes she even claims that it's meant to represent the voice of God.
И действительно, так я чувствую, что во мне, в общем, 4 крови. И даже не 2, а 4. Потому что, с одной стороны, с отцовской я татарка, с материнской я славянка. Но очень большую роль для меня играл вот этот директор музыкальной школы. И я его воспринимала как второго отца. Это еврейская кровь. Значит, у меня педагоги самые важные евреи. И духовная пища от немецкой культуры.
Despite the straitjacket of repression, Gubaidulina's interest in religion, in mystical experience, and in all the ancient traditions of her country have allowed her to find her own voice, a beautiful sound, unfamiliar to Western experience. In Zeitgestalten, or time cycles, she said she wanted to flesh out her feeling that time was not only linear, but somehow vertical, stacked up. In the third movement that we play here, we're in the crux of this tension, like in some great storm. Throughout the piece, one of the most striking sounds is the noise of the 2 bass guitars. She told me that she'd had a nightmare vision of apartment life in which the only way you could tell you even had neighbours was by hearing the non-stop boom of stereo bass lines through the floorboards. Then she looked at me with a strange smile and said, "Maybe if you lifted up a floorboard, you would find it wasn't an apartment at all, but hell." In a dangerous world, secrets abound, and sometimes to survive, artists had to create a self-sufficient universe. The Hungarian composer György Kurtag shows us another way of expressing experience. His music sounds as if all the notes had to be compressed to fit into a small box full of secrets, as though everything had been boiled down to its essence and hidden. He hints at Wagnerian proportions, using Webern's tiny language. And the story he tells is as bleak as it is passionate. underpinning the whole piece are repeated guitar chords, starting with unadorned open strings. At the very beginning, they're just presented simply. However, as the piece moves on, it becomes obvious that these chords mean something much more important. It's as if they define a journey, the point where we start off from and the point that we will eventually return to. Moving and altering like a vessel in a sea of memories. Beckett again. Now, Kurtag has suggested that the football sirens in this piece might be just signs of exuberant life. But to me, the sudden eruptions and equally sudden disappearances sound sinister. It's as though we're all being dragged through life kicking and screaming. Eventually, the journey seems to find peace with itself. Bells toll, and a trumpet speaks of a kind of stoic acceptance of life and death, somewhere between a lament and a lullaby. And we're left once more with our beginning, the slowly turning guitar chords. You can imagine how hard it was to choose the music for the end of a series like this. You're spoilt for choice because there's just so much stimulating music about. Just before I was engulfed by the weight of my own responsibility, I took the plunge and settled on an entirely British selection. This wasn't so difficult, because this country is producing a dazzling array of talent, all the more impressive for being so diverse in style and content. It's music I believe to be important, and it's music I have direct and personal connections with. But it's also music that I love, and it gives me pleasure time and time again. If the title for this final journey could be called From the Earth to the Air, we're beginning somewhere deep in the primeval crust. Like so much of the music of our time, Harrison Birtwistle is looking back, but not only into the history of any art, more to the history of our own planet. If there was ever music that seemed to issue forth from the bowels of the earth, this is it. Ritual Fragment was designed to be unconducted. Now, Harry once told me he thought that conductors were by far the most overrated of all musicians. I think he's probably right. So in this piece, the bass drum takes centre stage. The bass drum conjures up all the spirits, mourners, preachers, whatever you might interpret these soloists to be. Every musician in the ensemble who can actually move makes a journey from one side of the stage to the centre to play a solo, and then to the other side, with all the connotations of Orpheus's journey to the underworld. I'm always struck by the simultaneous impression of grandeur and claustrophobia. This music truly sounds like nothing else ever written. And as it evokes some strange, unknowable pre-human past, it gives an even more puzzling sensation of having always been there, of somehow having written itself. My choice of music now becomes even more personal, because the last two composers are not only British, but are of my generation and are also good friends. Mark Anthony Turnage is a poet of the urban landscape. His sound world is recognisable in seconds. The wailing saxophones, the heavy beat of percussion, everything stinks of the idea of the street, the loneliness of the street, as though one of Hopper's great American masterpieces had suddenly been transferred to 90s London. Like a lot of music at the end of the 20th century, Mark's is full of references, but this doesn't mean that his music is derivative. When he lifts from jazz, and there's a whole lot of Charlie Parker and Mingus in his music, or when he explores the kind of world in which Stravinsky walked, he makes it his own. This piece is very important, not only to me, but to the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, because it was one of the last fruits of the 4 years that we spent with Mark as our composer in residence. And in fact, a lot of the orchestra's personality is enshrined in the music he wrote for us. We all feel as though our fingerprints are all over this piece. The composer of our final work is Oliver Knussen, and Ollie, as we all know him, is a central figure in musical life today, be it as composer, conductor, teacher, or just a pure inspirer.
At Oxley, near Watford, lives a 6-foot schoolboy who could well become one of the leading figures in serious music. His father is Stuart Nusson, principal double bass with the London Symphony Orchestra. 15-year-old Oliver Nusson has been composing since he was 6. Now he's just completed his first symphony, nearly 90 pages of it.
He was a child prodigy with all the blessings and all the curses that can bring. A child prodigy who somehow survived.
Incidentally, Oliver's absolutely confident about his musical future. He's not even taking any O-levels. There just isn't time.
Once again, it's music that refers back. It looks, first and foremost, back to that great giant of our century, Stravinsky, taking his early piece Fireworks as a background. However, it also refers back to Debussy, Mussorgsky, and a whole range of other composers that Ollie loves and knows so well, but particularly in the music that explores childhood. It's not the childhood of lost innocence, like in Britain, but the childhood of brilliant, whirring ideas and inventions. It's a wonderful piece to end the series with, because it tells us so much about music as we begin to move into our next century. It tells us that music doesn't have to be weighty to be profound. It reminds us that 20th century music is in wonderful good health. But to me, most important of all, it shows us that the pleasure principle, which is, after all, the nearest thing to a guiding philosophy behind this series, is still alive and well. This is music of energy, colour and delight, and it leaps off the page with all the force of its title, Flourish with Fireworks.